Canon's top-of-the-line $6,500 full-frame sports camera is here, and it's remarkable. It shoots 20 frames per second, has full-width 4K. It does 4K 60 with some limitations, and overall, it could be a game changer for the 2020 Olympics. I am going to compile all the information from all the other reviewers. I'm going to cut through all of the marketing BS for you, and I'm going to talk about how this tech might trickle down into other cameras. But first, a word from our sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace makes this possible. Squarespace makes amazing websites possible too. And if that's something you're interested in, you should check them out. You can make an amazing portfolio that provides a much better user experience than, say, Instagram or Facebook. Those just show your most recent pictures. A Squarespace website shows your best pictures and it makes them look beautiful. It even gives you a store so that you can sell your prints or take down payments from clients, and you can track your analytics whether you're at a computer or on the go. If you want to check it out, go to squarespace.com/Tony. Just do the 14-day free trial. You can set up your website and see if you love it. And if you do, the coupon code Tony will get you 10% off. The specs on this camera, they are upping the frames per second from 14 frames per second to 16 frames per second when using the optical viewfinder. That looks like this. That's the way most sports photographers, wildlife photographers, the people who actually use this, they use the viewfinder 99% of the time. So in practice, 16 frames per second is what the camera is capable of. But there's a very important caveat to that number. That is 16 frames per second without wasting any time autofocusing between frames. When we tested the 1DX Mark II, it was advertised at 14 frames per second, but we found real world sports, we got about 11 frames per second. The reason for that is, in between every shot, the camera needs to move the mirror back down and then examine the scene to determine whether it needs to refocus. It then needs to reposition the lens, move the mirror back up, and then take another picture. And that focusing causes a little bit of a delay. So the 16 frames per second is very theoretical. The actual realized frames per second you get is going to depend on a number of factors, the amount of available light, which could influence the focusing speed, the lens you're using. Different lenses have different focusing motors and might take longer to get into position. And so that actual 16 frames per second, you're not going to realize it unless you're locked off in manual focus mode. Now, that's something you can do. There are lots of sports where the player isn't moving. For example, a batter in baseball. You could configure the camera to use back button AF on, and if the subject isn't moving, just release that back button and take 16 frames per second. So it's not that it's completely impractical, but you should understand in real world situations like tracking a soccer player, the actual frames per second you get is probably going to be more like 11 or 12 frames per second, but we'll have to test the actual production camera to give you a more specific number. They also are advertising 20 frames per second. That's a big deal. That's matching the numbers that are produced by the amazing Sony A9 and A9 Mark II. But like those cameras, it does not work with the mirror up. This only works in live view. And what that means is if you want to achieve 20 frames per second, you're holding the camera out like this. And this is really weird. Now, with a wide angle lens, this can be okay, though it's a very, very heavy camera to be holding kind of at arm's length and looking at the rear screen. You do not get 20 frames per second when you have it up to your eye like that because the viewfinder is blacked out. There's nothing there. If you want to get that 20 frames per second, you have to be using the rear screen, but you're also not going to get the full autofocus speed. The camera would offer autofocus, but it's the live view autofocus like a mirrorless camera. And the way the Canon cameras work is they have dual pixel autofocus, which is very accurate. It's very smooth. It's perfect for video, but for shooting sports, it's not nearly as good as the Sony mirrorless cameras. It just doesn't move quickly. So for still subjects, yes, you can use the rear screen to get 20 frames per second. For a running soccer player, no, it's not really going to keep up, so that's not going to be that scenario. For a running soccer player at 20 frames per second, a Sony A9 or a Sony A9 Mark II would be better. But there's an important difference in how they shoot 20 frames per second. The Canon 1DX will shoot 20 frames per second with the mechanical shutter or the electronic silent shutter. The Sony A9 will shoot 20 frames per second only with a silent electronic shutter. And that is an important difference. The mechanical shutter completely eliminates any rolling shutter, which are artifacts that cause moving subjects to kind of appear slanty like this. The A9 doesn't really have a problem with that, but where it does have a problem is with banding. When shooting with fast shutter speeds under LED lights, which are typical in sports venues like big auditoriums, especially at night, you will get banding. You will get banding in many realistic scenarios depending on your shutter speed. At slower shutter speeds, it's never been a problem. And I tend to shoot nighttime sports at slower and slower shutter speeds to improve my image quality. But I know some photographers out there in the real world never drop the shutter speed down below like 4,000ths or 1/2000th of a second. If that's the case, you might see banding with a Sony A9 depending on the lighting conditions, but you would not see banding with a 1DX, regardless of whether you're using the rear screen or the viewfinder, as long as you're using that mechanical shutter. The A9 only offers the mechanical shutter at 10 frames per second. So if you're concerned about banding, if it might be a possibility and you don't want your pictures ruined, you'd have to revert to the mechanical shutter, meaning in this case, the 1DX is actually significantly faster than the A9. I want to talk more about live view. With live view, the focusing points go out to the edges of the screen, and in fact, it can focus at f11, which means you could stack a whole bunch of teleconverters if you're inclined to, and at -6 EV, which is just, it's like super, super dark. But it does not have a tilting screen. So you have to work out with the camera like this, but you cannot tilt the screen, which means if the camera is low, you also have to be really low, and you cannot use the viewfinder, as I said. There's also a little bit of lag. Now, this lag is significantly less than your human reaction time of about half a second. On the A9, we've tested it to be about 35 milliseconds. It's not that big of a deal. On the 1DX, we'll need to test that. We don't know. But the Canon cameras with live view tend to have quite a bit of lag, and it might be too much to be shooting fast-moving sports. Not that the focusing system could keep up with that anyway. The buffer on this camera is pretty incredible thanks to having dual CF Express card slots. Essentially, you will be able to hold the shutter down forever until the card fills up. Canon is advertising more than 1,000 frames of RAW plus JPEG shooting. Realistically, you're not going to stop at 1,000. It will keep unloading and shooting. This camera also offers HEIF files, which are the type of highly compressed JPEG-like files that the iPhone shoots by default. HEIF files have better quality than JPEGs, and they're about half the size. They also offer 10-bit color. It's interesting that the buffer size decreases so much when you shoot HEIF files. Now you drop down to a 300 shot buffer. It's not bottlenecked by the file size or the bandwidth writing to the card, so it's bottlenecked by the processing time. These HEIF files must require quite a bit of processing time from the Canon. By the way, the Sony A9 and A9 Mark II, they have about a 200 shot buffer. So even shooting JPEGs plus RAW, you'll get that. So even if you're shooting HEIF on the Canon, your buffer is still going to be bigger. The buffer will unload faster to the cards. Some important features are trickling up to the 1DX Mark III, including Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, so you can connect to it from your Canon app. This is something a lot of wedding photographers find really important nowadays because they want to be able to deliver some pictures instantly, because let's face it, clients expect that. They want beautiful pictures and they want to show them on their Instagram right away. This will allow you to do that. They've also added a GPS module to the device. Thank goodness. I find GPS to be incredibly useful for sorting my pictures later. I can go into the map module in Lightroom and, for example, sort by which arena I was at and then which day I was at, and kind of instantly find pictures that otherwise would have been more difficult. The 1DX Mark III also has a gigabit Ethernet wired connection, so you can wire it directly to a server. You probably don't need that, but if you do, and your ears are perking up right now, it'll just move the files a little bit faster so you can keep up with that high frame rate. You can also add an optional external Wi-Fi module to get a little bit of a quicker signal. A unique user interface element here is the smart controller. The AF on button now has an optional ability to allow you to scroll your thumb over it and move focusing points. So there is still a thumbstick that you can move your thumb to and manually select the autofocusing point, but the smart controller makes it a little bit easier and a little bit smoother if you're not using the sort of tracking features that it has in the different modes. Canon is advertising a high detail, low pass filter. One of the problems we had with the 1DX Mark III and the Nikon D5 is they had a very heavy anti-aliasing filter. The anti-aliasing filter's job is to eliminate moire in photos by sort of blurring together the separate red, green, and blue pixels. This prevents fringing, especially with fabrics and stuff that sports photographers are often shooting. This is important. The filter was so heavy though that it just killed detail. So these cameras are only 20 megapixels to begin with. If you were to compare them against a 24 megapixel camera with no AA filter, what we saw was massive amounts of better detail. In fact, comparing the Nikon D5 to the Nikon D500, which did not have an anti-aliasing filter, made a big difference. So we're glad to see Canon back down on how heavy their AA filter would be. All the images you see today are pre-production images and thus cannot be used for comparison purposes. I guarantee you the images compared to the previous generation are going to be noticeably sharper. Let's talk about the video capabilities. They're pushing the 4K and even 5.5K features on this camera really hard, but there are limitations you should understand. If you need Canon's amazing dual pixel autofocus while you're recording, here is what the camera can do. It can do full width 4K 30. This means it's catching up to all the Sony cameras and all the recent Nikon cameras. Canon's finally doing full width 4K. Previous Canon cameras all required heavy cropping when shooting in 4K. This is great news. It also shoots 4K at 60 frames per second with autofocus, but only with a 1.5 times crop. So now it's basically an APS-C camera, but at 4K 60. It will also shoot 5.5K RAW, which is just slightly bigger than 4K video. When I say RAW, it's like literally the raw data from a series of photos that you would be able to push and pull just like a RAW photo. It's advertising 12 bits, so that means you could bring up the shadows significantly. This is not easy to do. Unless you've shot and processed and published RAW video before, you're probably not going to find this feature useful. It really requires very careful filming techniques, but also an extremely talented colorist to be able to make use of that in any situation which would warrant it. Like most lighting situations, you limit the dynamic range by controlling the lighting. However, there are times when maybe you need to shoot out in the desert and you're shooting into the sun and you want to properly bring up the shadows on a foreground subject and for some reason you can't add artificial light. That's the kind of situation where raw video might be useful to you, but it's only theoretically useful because you would still have to grade it in such a way that it looked natural. You could raise the shadows up so you could see everything, but it's definitely gonna look weird, as it would if you were trying to process a raw photo and recover 4 or 5 stops of shadows. It ends up looking a little bit HDR. Now, I do see that in movies and TV shows. Like, people do this in the real world, and I notice it, but maybe other people don't. But I don't want you to think you can just go do this and shoot casually. It's a very serious task with a lot of post-production. With autofocus, it will also shoot slow motion 120 frames per second at 1080. A little disappointing that we couldn't go a little bit faster, like 240 frames per second. If you're willing to shoot manual focus, you can do 4K at 60 frames per second full width, and you can get 10-bit 422 C-Log HEVC for that. So it's no longer doing the slow, inefficient motion JPEG files that just consumed so much memory card so quickly. That's a big improvement for video shooters who might want to use this kind of odd form factor for their video production. The camera has 191 focusing points, and the focusing points in the center, they're this new sort of higher resolution focusing point that we'll really just have to test side by side with the old model. Canon's beefed up the processors in this camera to be able to process things faster, up to 380 times faster autofocus processing. And what that could mean is actually achieving a higher frames per second in real world shooting. It has face detect when you're using the optical viewfinder. So basically it can use the camera's off-sensor metering system to find faces and the shapes of bodies, and it will move the focusing points up to the face whenever you're shooting sports. That will essentially mean slightly easier focusing on people in sports, but also slightly sharper pictures because it's going to be focusing where you want it to focus, which is on the face. When you're using the rear screen live view out like this, it will have eye detect autofocus just like we've seen in the EOS R. We find that to be accurate but slow. So this could be useful for some wedding and portrait photographers, for example. As long as they don't mind holding the camera out like this, it could make life a little bit easier. The 1DX Mark III has some illuminated buttons, and here is an image from DP Review TV's video where you can see some of those buttons are lit up. It's not all the buttons, but on the D500 and D5, we had this and we found it to be extremely useful in dark situations. At some point in your camera experience, your fingers know where all the buttons are automatically, but there's always times when I want to find some less frequently used button. Let's talk about the dual CF Express cards. It's kind of a big deal because it's allowing an amazingly fast write speed of probably about 1200 megabytes a second. Compare that to what we actually get out of an A9 with UHS-2 cards, which is limited to about 80 megabytes per second write speed, like real world using memory cards. However, those memory cards are going to be significantly more expensive. It's about $200 for a 128 gig card or $400 for a 256 gig card. So I use 256 gig cards now just to make sure I never run out of space. You'd be spending $800 to get 2 of those. But the performance is amazing and could really be worth it. And if we talk about it in comparison to the A9, the fact that the buffer will clear so much faster would resolve one of the big problems we have with the A9, which is that it basically limits your functionality while it's clearing the buffer, a process that could take several minutes. It's not going to be a problem on the 1DX Mark III. Physically, the 1DX Mark III is almost indistinguishable from the 1DX Mark II, and as we look at them side by side, they're the same. And that's what pros want. They don't want to learn new buttons. Their fingers know where the buttons are. To move anything around would kill their muscle memory and ruin pictures. So Canon just never messes with the formula. The new camera is $6,500, which is the same price the 1DX Mark II was launched at. However, now the 1DX Mark II is $5,500 or about $4,000 used. So many of you will be better off picking up a 1DX Mark II. If you don't need those sort of very narrow video features, the autofocus improvements and the slightly higher frame rate, they're really kind of a minor incremental improvement that in the real world won't make too much of a difference for most sports photographers. Basically, if you're shooting with a 1DX Mark II and like you're struggling with the buffer, this camera will fix it. If you're struggling with recording video on it, this camera will probably improve that. If you wish the autofocus were a little bit better, nobody complains about the autofocus, but if that is a problem for you, then maybe this camera is a wise investment. Compared to the Sony A9 and A9 Mark II, you can see it's a massive difference. The 1DX Mark III is huge compared to the A9. That is a plus for many photographers and a negative for many others. The features are quite different. The A9 Mark II new is $4,500, so it's significantly cheaper. We also see a real 20 frames per second out of the A9 Mark II with a variety of different lenses. Sharp, real 20 frames per second, whereas the number from the 1DX Mark III, when using the Viewfinder, at most theoretically would be 16 frames per second, but in practice it's probably going to be more like 12 frames per second based on our experience with previous editions of it. The A9 Mark II only does 4K 30. In some modes, the 1DX Mark III will do 4K 60, so it's kind of surprising to see Canon actually outperforming the A9 in video capabilities. The A9, however, has a tilt screen, which means if you are using the rear screen, you have a lot more flexibility. You could position it low. If you're a photojournalist and you need to shoot over a crowd of other photojournalists to get a picture, you could hold it up over your head and still see it easier than you could with a 1DX because you could tilt the screen towards yourself. The buffer on the 1DX will clear much faster. As I mentioned, the A9 has an electronic viewfinder, which offers absolutely no blackout and just a tiny bit of lag. The optical viewfinder on the 1DX offers 0 lag and face AF instead of the IAF that the A9 has. So disadvantages and advantages on either side. The A9 Mark II we found it has good weather sealing. However, the 1DX is essentially bulletproof and is designed to be rained on and stuff. If I were stuck in terrible weather, I would rather have the 1DX, but at the same time, we've never had a problem with the weather sealing on the A9 Mark II. This is $6,500. It'll be launched in February 2020. And if you want to pick it up, head to sdp.io/1DX3. Here are some of the things that we're disappointed about. No sensor stabilization. It's taken Canon way too long to get this. Now, if you are a photographer and you're using all image stabilized lenses, you do not care about this at all. But if you sometimes use unstabilized primes, to have the sensor stabilized provides an incredible amount of flexibility. It's a feature that's available on very inexpensive cameras from other manufacturers, so it's painful to see that Canon still isn't offering it. The Canon is offering a lot of its most exciting features only when using the rear screen. It would be so nice if you could have an electronic viewfinder in the optical viewfinder by creating a hybrid viewfinder. Canon has a patent around this. We've discussed some very practical and fairly easy to implement ways to integrate an electronic viewfinder into the optical viewfinder that would make that possible. Almost all photographers who would pick up the 1DX are going to be relying primarily on the viewfinder, and that means they're giving up some amazing features like eye detect, autofocus. If they could just integrate those together, this would have been a knockout, but all the various limitations requiring you to switch between different modes makes it kind of frustrating. There's also no tilt screen on this camera, which is really too bad. Canon will not change the form factor on these cameras ever. They just don't want to mess with the formula that every pro knows. But tilt screens, especially for photojournalists who are often shooting at weird angles, incredibly useful. And they're advertising it as a video camera. And often you want your video camera to be very low and it's mounted to a tripod or a gimbal. And being able to tilt the screen is a significant improvement to productivity. It's still just 20 megapixels, and I think no pros are really asking for more. They're happy about that. The reduction in the heaviness of the AA filter is going to give you more detail, so it's not like you will still get sharper images. But at the same time, at least giving us a bump to 24 megapixels would have been nice. There's also no USB charging, which means when you're traveling, you're still going to have to travel with the fairly huge charging pack that's required to charge the massive 1DX Mark III batteries. Even if it took all night to charge it, that would mean you could charge it overnight, and charging it overnight would be enough. There's also no direct internet access, a feature that's not offered by any modern camera, but which we really kind of need. The ability to share pictures directly to, say, cloud storage would mean that pro photographers could have an instant backup, even if their camera was stolen. Why not just give us file sync? You have Wi-Fi in there. Give us the ability to connect to an access point or to our cell phone's tethering hotspot and sync that stuff up to cloud storage so that editors can get it and we have an offline backup instantaneously. It could be done with a firmware update. On the top, they still have the old style retro LCD, a device that was implemented in the 70s first. On their much less expensive Canon EOS R, they give it a very nice screen, but the $6,500 camera gets the crappy old harder to read screen. Let's say a few words about the problems with pre-production reviews now. All the reviews of the Canon 1DX Mark III right now are pre-production reviews, and those suffer from serious limitations. I know this from experience because we've created many of them and we work closely with manufacturers, and we've decided not to do pre-production reviews anymore because of these problems. Let me say that as a reviewer, my job is to tell you what doesn't work well on a device. The ads tell you what's good about the camera. The manufacturer is happy to tell you about all the great features. You don't need camera reviewers to tell you about the things that work well. You need reviewers to tell you about the things that don't work well. And on pre-production cameras, we actually don't have that flexibility. I've found so many bugs in various pre-production cameras, and then I let the manufacturer know about it and they say, oh, well, you can't talk about that bug because we're planning to fix it before release, or maybe we're going to fix it before release. And what that means is I am not a reviewer anymore. I'm suddenly an unpaid beta tester. The problems I find, I am silenced on in the hopes that the manufacturer solves it to everyone's satisfaction. Sometimes they have, and sometimes they haven't. But either way, I cannot confidently talk about the problems of a pre-production camera, and I think manufacturers are actually using this mechanism to their advantage. They're also limiting image quality comparison, saying, oh, you can show sample pictures, but you have to label them pre-production, and for example, you can't show them side by side against other cameras. And what this means is if the image quality is worse, which it sometimes is in new cameras, you can't talk about it until after the camera is released. And that means this very important group of people who pre-order the camera don't have the information they need to purchase the camera. I'm telling you this because I'm urging you to wait until the production camera is out and we have more of a chance to review it in the real world before spending $6,500 on it. Trust me, I want the affiliate money from your $6,500 camera pre-order, but I'd rather you just wait a little bit and spend the money only when you're confident that it's going to be a good investment for you. Thank you to our sponsor, Squarespace, who makes this possible. If you want an amazing website to show off your work, to pull in new clients, to make you look like the best photographer possible, use Squarespace. They make it so you don't have to be a big nerd. You can focus on the art and science of photography. You create the images and then you just drag and drop them into a variety of different templates that can be personalized to match your individual style. If this sounds great to you, go to squarespace.com/Tony and do a free trial. Just put your pictures up there. Make a site that tells the world about you and the amazing work that you create. If you love it, after 14 days, you can use the coupon code TONY and you'll get 10% off. Thanks, Squarespace. In the comments down below, I'd like to hear what you're excited about the 1DX Mark III, how it's going to actually change your photography in the real world, and also what you might be disappointed about, what you think it should have been. Thanks.